The first two narratives of Genesis seem to portray the Garden of Eden as the place where God resides, reigns, and relates to the people he created. According to theologian G.K. Beale, the depicted reality in Genesis 2 and 3 is quite similar to God's relationship to the one he had with his people in the time of the tabernacle and the temple. This passage was a big red flag to the original audience. This narrative, surprise, had a strong correlation to the original Torah audience. These nomadic children of Israel were very aware of Yahweh's indwelling of the tabernacle. They would see daily the movement and working of the spirit of cloud of God as he was active in the Holy of Holies. God's presence was a reality to them. And we need to grasp that. You see, they were also aware of the activities of the Levitical priesthood, those who represented God to the people, those who would serve and keep the tabernacle. The imagery of the temple and priest would stand out to the original audience in Genesis 2 and 3. Likewise, during the monarchy of Israel under Solomon, this same imagery would once again be made manifest to those in Jerusalem at the time of the dedication of the temple. The point is, we need to see and understand that Adam and Eve, being on the top of the Garden of Eden, had a distinct connection to the temple that we just can't overlook. Eden was the temple of God on earth. Man and woman, his image bearers, were created to be his image, his rulers, and his priests. He put them in his temple for a specific purpose. With that in mind, let's spend some time discussing this temple. After all, why does God need a temple on earth? And now, let me be clear. This is another one of those onion issues. In order to truly grasp it, we have some layers we still need to start peeling off and maybe cry a little bit too. But first off, to the ancient Near East, which we spent quite a bit of time discussing, temples were a reality. They were common as grocery stores are today. What I mean by this is the religious practices which we seem to think, look at, and even get horrified with when were kind of the norm in the world at the time. So they were a reality to all who lived in this region, whether the Sumerian gods, the Egyptian gods, or Mesopotamian gods, or any other local pantheon. These early religions all shared two certain common traits. Two of these common traits were form of priesthood and temples. The priests were to be the communicators, the deity, who represented man to their gods. Now, before we go on, I do think it's highly significant that water is coming forth from the temple garden. And that's something I don't want us to overlook either. Water, which breaks off and feeds, well, the entire earth, as we see in Genesis chapter 2. We must not overlook this. We see both the prophet Ezekiel and John continue to tease out this idea in scripture. In Ezekiel, the water which feeds the whole earth, the water which purifies the earth, comes from the temple of God. In Revelation 22, we see the same image. Water comes from the temple. Living water comes from the temple. In the Gospel of John, the apostle spends a great deal of time working with living water imagery. John crafts the narratives to reveal that living water comes forth from Jesus. Get this, the perfect temple. This is getting ahead of ourselves for the moment. However, be sure to check out the living water video in the deeper dive section in this lesson to see how John literally teases this out. It's a very good video. But for now, I want us to return to our temple discussion and see how the priests historically functioned primarily in serving and keeping the temples of the gods. We need to realize God did not create the Garden of Eden as a nice place for Adam and Eve to live. Rather, he creates it as a convergent space where they can have a relationship with him. Let me say that again. Eden was not just to be a good place for male and female to live. It is to be the place on earth where God and humanity can converge or come together and fulfill the creation mandate. So let me clarify what I mean first off by convergent space. Convergent space is a place where God, who is outside of creation, time and space, breaks into our reality, time and space, and converges with what he has created in that space. So the mountaintop temple of Garden of Eden is a place where God meets with his image-bearing creations. You could say it's quite a mountaintop experience. The Garden of Eden, then, was the place where God's presence dwelt in a special kind of way. Not seen since. However, Revelation 20 through 22, we'll see it again. Now, God dwelt with his creation in a way where his people can be with him and worship him. Interestingly, later on, when the tabernacle is being built, we see all sorts of garden imagery. In one of the least favorite parts of the Bible of Exodus for most people, we see the section devoted to the building of the tabernacle, Exodus chapter 25 to 31. We see several things which should return our attention to Eden. I encourage you to read Exodus 25 to 31, or just skim through it this week and look at these chapters and see if you can spot any in these images. Images such as, for example, 7-branched gold lampstand. Yes, 7-branched. This lampstand, the menorah in chapter 25, which theologian G.K. Beale sees representing the tree of life, once again, is right there. But that's a topic for another time. That being said, the Exodus passage gives us a strong contextual understanding of one of the weirdest verses in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis 2:12, for example, it gives context to this just seeming like rabbit trail in the garden account, where out of nowhere it decides to mention gold, bdellium, and this intriguing onyx stone, whatever that is. Interestingly, this precious onyx stone pops up again 7 times in the tabernacle passage. Check it out. It emerges when discussing the ephod, or the breastpiece of the high priest. Again, 7 times. And for the high priest. Interestingly, this word, very rare in the Bible, shows up again later in Ezekiel 28, where Ezekiel is discussing Eden. And interestingly, he mentions the onyx as a stone that was to cover a figure who theologian C.H. Wright believes to be Adam. Now, why is this significant? Well, Adam was, after all, the first priest of Yahweh. Likewise, as you read through the tabernacle passage, don't forget to recognize as you read the trees. Yes, the trees. Another image we're going to unpack in future lessons. Now, however, not only are the trees and imagery embroidered and cut into the tabernacle and its furniture, but I also take time to realize that the Ark of the Covenant has a cherubim placed upon it to protect the holy seat. It's also stitched into the curtain of the Holy of Holies. Spoiler, cherubim images here. It's the same kind of angel which is placed at the entry of Eden to protect the garden temple from man, as we'll eventually see in Genesis 3:24. My point is, to the original audience, this garden and its occupants and their responsibilities were very recognizable to them and how they lived. These images and concepts were around them daily. They were not mysterious or foreign concepts to the original audience. They were very familiar to them. These images were recognizable to them in the tabernacle, the priesthood, on pictures, on images. They could easily see the correlation between the tabernacle and Eden and the garden and the tabernacle. So must we if we're truly going to grasp this text. Likewise, in later writings of Scripture, we see the similarities between Eden and Solomon's temple. In reading the creation accounts of Solomon's temple, you can also see the abundance of Eden imagery throughout the temple. The point is, the Garden of Eden foreshadows the future sanctuaries. Whether it's the temple or the tabernacle, this means the Garden of Eden is the archetype or the model which establishes the pattern for later earthly sanctuaries. It's also interesting to note that the first temple, the Garden Temple, was a temple not built by human hands. Hold on to that as well. It was actually originally borrowed and asked by God. Anyway, in essence, when man encounters the presence of God through the tabernacle or through the later temple, they're trying to recapture the wonderful and highly personal relationship with Adam and Eve in the garden. That's what's going on in the temple. The priests are trying to recapture that relationship that was lost to Adam and Eve in the garden, trying to get back. We see these shadow temples being revealed to be exactly that in Revelation 21 and 22, where we see the entire world, yes, the entire world, is finally brought into being a garden temple. So in essence, the story starts with God and his images in the garden and ends with God and his images in the garden when we look at Genesis to Revelation. A garden that has been fashioned to spread through all creation. So let me leave you with a quote by theologian Dr. J. Daniel Hayes. God did not create the Garden of Eden merely to give Adam and Eve a nice place to live, but to provide a special place where they can relate to him and be blessed by his presence. Convergent space.